Hi, welcome. My name is Tedi, and what I'd like to talk, I'm a graduate student at Harvard Medical School, and what I'd like to talk to you about today are some of the lessons that we've learned about the brain from diagnosis and treatment of psychiatric disorders. And more specifically, I'd like to start by exploring the definition of psychiatric disorders to try and get a firmer grasp on what we're actually talking about. We'll then delve into one example of some of the lessons that we've learned from the treatment of one disorder in particular, and then we'll end by touching on what the future may hold for the diagnosis and treatment of psychiatric disorders. Okay, so I think an important place to start is the fact that psychiatric disorders are pretty ubiquitous. According to the National Institutes of Health, or the NIH, about 4% of the overall population suffers from a psychiatric disorder. And this number is pretty stable whether we break the population down according to gender, age group, or ethnicity. So it's really quite a ubiquitous problem that affects a wide range of people. But if you think about it, in order to generate statistics like this, we have to have an agreed upon definition of what a psychiatric disorder actually is. And this, arriving at such a definition, is actually a trickier business than you might think at first glance. And there are a couple of reasons for this. So within the population, there's going to be a diverse array of psychological traits, and I've just put a few up here as examples. Now, each of these traits is going to exist across a spectrum of intensity, ranging from high intensity to low intensity. So there's going to be a lot of heterogeneity within the population. And so this raises the question then of where do we draw the line between health and disorder? Do we draw it here and say that anyone who experiences any form of anxiety has a disorder? Or do we draw it here and say that only those individuals experiencing the most intense form of these traits have a disorder? Or is the distinction a bit more nuanced? So currently, psychiatric disorders are diagnosed according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM, which is a volume published by the American Psychiatric Association. And according to this volume, a psychiatric disorder is, quote, a syndrome characterized by clinically significant disturbance in an individual's cognition, emotion regulation, or behavior that reflects a dysfunction in the psychological, biological, or developmental processes underlying mental function. So let's break this down. First of all, the definition specifies that a psychiatric disorder is a syndrome. And so a syndrome, in turn, is defined as a group of symptoms. So the DSM then is being pretty explicit about the fact that psychiatric diagnoses are not being made based on biological metrics, but rather are based on symptomatic presentation. So the second point that I want to mention is that the definition states that these symptoms that we observe must reflect a dysfunction in processes underlying mental function. But how do we measure this? I mean, that's kind of a problematic issue. And although there are agreed upon metrics by which to measure this dysfunction, they are, again, based on symptomatic presentation. And so ultimately, I think there is some degree of subjectivity involved in making a psychiatric diagnosis. Nevertheless, the DSM does put forward a series of categorically defined disorders, and I've just listed 5 of the major ones here. So we have depression, schizophrenia, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, bipolar disorder, and autism. And these are by no means comprehensive, but these are just some of the ones that we'll be talking about today. And so for each of these disorders, there's actually a very detailed list of symptoms that must be present in order for the diagnosis to be made. And I just want to give you one example using major depressive disorder. So according to the DSM, an individual must present at least 5 of these 9 symptoms for a period of at least 2 weeks in order to be diagnosed with major depressive disorder. And one of those 5 symptoms has to be either depressed mood daily or diminished pleasure in daily activities. And so I just want to take a few minutes to go through some of the other disorders that I mentioned, just to give you a feel for some of the common symptoms that are experienced, and you might begin to observe that there's some overlap in the symptoms that we see with each of these disorders. So let's start with bipolar disorder, which is a disorder that affects adults. And these individuals experience 2 kinds of episodes. They experience depressive episodes where they may feel sad or anxious or guilty, and at other times they'll have manic episodes during which they may go for prolonged periods of time without sleep. There may be elevated or irritable mood, racing thoughts, things of this nature. So they sort of oscillate between these 2 kinds of episodes. Another disorder affecting adults is schizophrenia, and these individuals experience two categories of symptoms, which are called positive and negative symptoms, which I hope you won't misinterpret to mean good and bad. Rather, they indicate the presence or the absence of certain kinds of experiences. So positive symptoms are those symptoms which are normally absent from healthy individuals. So examples are hallucinations or delusions. Negative symptoms, on the other hand, refers to the absence of what you could call a normal experience. So an individual experiencing negative symptoms might have diminished emotional expression or a general lack of drive. And as we mentioned earlier, psychiatric disorders affect people of all ages, including children. And ADHD, I think, is one of the most well-known childhood disorders, and is characterized by deficits in attention, hyperactive behavior, and enhanced impulsivity. And finally, another developmental disorder is autism. And children with this disorder are characterized by impaired social interaction, which is due in part to an impairment of verbal and nonverbal communication. And so a large part of the struggle of the last century has been to try and understand the biology that underlies each of these defined disorders. And though it may seem a little bit backwards, much of what we've come to learn about the biology underlying each of these disorders actually comes from our attempt to treat them with pharmacotherapies or with drugs. So I want to delve into one example specifically. So we talked about depression being characterized by depressed mood and diminished pleasure or interest in daily activities, along with some other symptoms. Now, the first drugs used to treat this disorder were called tricyclic antidepressants, or TCAs, named after their chemical structure shown here, which contains these 3 cyclic rings. And it's kind of an interesting story. These drugs were first developed with the intent to treat psychotic disorders such as schizophrenia. But in the 1950s, physicians noticed that individuals on TCAs were actually becoming less depressed. And so TCAs quickly became sort of the standard of care for depression. By the 1970s, however, a new class of drug had been introduced called SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. One of them is Prozac, with which you might be familiar. And so in order to understand how these classes of drugs are working, we really need to delve into some basic neurobiology. But before we do that, I just want to pause and take any questions that you might have about what we've covered so far. Yes?
When you say there's no biological kind of benchmark,
yeah.
But the fact that we use drugs, doesn't it mean that we can already measure to some degree some biological symptoms?
Yes.
Because otherwise, how do we use drugs to treat that?
Right. Okay, that's a great question. So the question was, I had said that diagnosis is not based on biological metrics, but based on symptoms. And the question is, if we can use drugs to treat these disorders, don't we know something about the biology? And the answer is yes, we do know something now. At the times that TCAs, for example, were first introduced, the biology was not known. It was a chemical compound about which the biology was subsequently learned, but the antidepressant effect of that class of drugs was the first observation, and the biology followed. And I think that's sort of where we are now. We are learning things about some of the biology that underlies these disorders, but unlike cancer diagnostics, where you can take a biopsy and run some tests or put it under the microscope, you can't do that in psychiatry yet. So that's what I was referring to. Yes?
So you're yet at the end of that statement.
Yes.
I mean, what's the general feeling among researchers like yourself who are looking at this? Are we going to get to the point where we can diagnose something like schizophrenia with a test? I mean, isn't it all, I mean, everything we do, there may be environmental factors, but aren't we just still creatures of the chemistry of our bodies?
So that's a very good question, and it's more nuanced than I'll be able to fully address right now, but basically I think there are a class of researchers and of clinicians who believe that we will be able to develop a biologically based diagnostic system that will generate more effective treatments. I think fundamentally, yes, our experiences are underlied by biology, but I think you know, we're on the road in that direction, but we're certainly not quite there yet. But we'll come back to that, because that's you know, I mean, I think that is the question on everyone's mind these days, and there are endeavors directed specifically at that question, and I'll touch on that at the end. Are there any other questions? Yeah?
On what basis were those drugs initially prescribed to people if it wasn't a solid understanding of the biology necessarily specific to the disorder they were trying to treat?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I have to admit, I'm not the expert in pharmacology or you know, treating with drugs. I'm not a clinician, but so I'll say with imipramine, with the TCAs, I believe that there was some evidence that they had an effect for psychotic disorders, and I'm not sure quite what that evidence was. I think the observation that they had an antidepressant effect was coincidental. With SSRIs, I believe that was actually the first psychotropic drug that was rationally designed, that was designed with a purpose to say, we know this about the drugs that work, about the biology of the drugs that work in depression, and we're going to try and make them better. So I hope that sort of gets at your question. Okay, any more questions? Okay, so I'll go on. So we left off asking how these antidepressant drugs actually work. So let's start with some very basic neurobiology. So the human brain, shown here in black, is composed of cells called neurons, shown here in red. And so each neuron contains this long process called an axon, which it uses to communicate with other neurons. And the neurons in your brain can send their axons from one end of the brain to the other. The neurons in your periphery can actually send their axons from high up in your spinal cord all the way down to your toes, which is how you have feeling in your toes. So it's just kind of an interesting fact, I think, that these axons can travel great distances and conduct signals across great distances. But in order to communicate with other cells, with other neurons, the axon releases chemicals called neurotransmitters, shown here as red diamonds. And these neurotransmitters cross the space between the two cells, which is called the synapse, and go on to interact with the downstream cell to either stimulate or suppress its activity. And I just want to mention that multiple cells communicating in this chemical fashion are referred to as a circuit, a neural circuit. So one such neurotransmitter that you might be familiar with is called serotonin, and it's made by a small group of cells in the brain called the serotonin neurons, aptly named serotonin neurons. And it's this neural system that is actually targeted by the antidepressant drugs, and I just want to walk you through exactly how that works. So normally, serotonin is released into the synapse, it has a chance to act on the downstream cell, and it's then actually taken back up into the cell that released it by traveling through a protein on the surface of that neuron called the serotonin transporter. Okay, so these black bars here are basically a channel, like a tunnel, like Mary mentioned, through which the serotonin can go back into the cell. And the effect of having this transporter here at the synapse is to limit the time during which serotonin can affect neighboring cells. So it's a time-limited effect of neurotransmitter release. What happens when you take an antidepressant drug is that the drug binds to this serotonin transporter, blocking it, so that now serotonin can't be taken back up, but rather remains in the synapse and has a prolonged opportunity to interact with the downstream cell. So what we've seen then is that antidepressant drugs increase the amount of serotonin outside the cells in the brain, and at the same time as they decrease depressive symptoms. And it's this combination of effects that has led to what's known as the serotonin hypothesis of depression, which posits that increased serotonin in the brain leads to decreased depressive symptoms. And in fact, other types of studies, such as gene association studies, have supported this hypothesis. So I just want to take you through one example. So earlier today, we heard about gene variants, right? Different forms of the same gene with different sequences. And so it turns out that the serotonin transporter is encoded by a gene that has two forms. There's a short form shown here in orange and a long form shown in blue. And in fact, these two forms of the serotonin transporter gene have different associations with the rate that individuals experience depressive symptoms. So let me show you the results from one such study that established this phenomenon. So this particular study was interested in looking for a correlation between which of these gene variants an individual carried and the probability that that individual would have a depressive episode. And beyond that, they were interested in the role that stress played in mediating that relationship. So what we're going to be plotting here is on the y-axis, the probability of having a major depressive episode, and on the x-axis, the number of stressful life events that an individual experienced. So 1 stressful event, 2, 3, or 4 or more. And so what they found was that individuals carrying the short form of the serotonin transporter gene had a very high probability of having a depressive episode as the amount of stress in their lives increased. Whereas individuals carrying the long form of the serotonin transporter gene had a much lower, a significantly lower probability of having a major depressive episode, even with increased stress. You can see this line is almost flat. And so studies like this kind of corroborate previous studies, largely from pharmacotherapy, that suggest that the serotonin system is associated with depression. But the fact is that serotonin can't be the whole picture, and there are a couple of reasons for this. So first of all, antidepressant drugs work for some people, but not for everyone. And even for those individuals for which they do work, they reduce symptoms, but they tend not to eliminate them, so it's not a cure. And so these facts suggest that serotonin just can't be the whole picture. And in fact, the newest classes of antidepressant therapies now target multiple neural systems in combination, including other neurotransmitter systems, such as the dopamine system and the norepinephrine system, in combination with the serotonin system to try and achieve a more complete effect. But there's another but, which is that even these newest therapies aren't completely effective, which, to me at least, raises the question of whether we're treating the right thing. So put another way, we can ask, how accurately do psychiatric diagnoses reflect the underlying biology? And this question has been addressed in part by gene-wide association studies, or genome-wide association studies, or GWAS studies, which again we heard about this morning, in which the genomes of individuals diagnosed with these different disorders are compared, and variations in genes are looked for that kind of correlate with the onset of these disorders. And what they found, in fact, is that there are some common genetic components to these 5 major disorders. So the reality of the situation is that there seem to be shared symptoms across psychiatric disorders and shared genetic components. And so perhaps these disorders are more similar than we had at first thought. And maybe a symptom-based system for diagnosing psychiatric disorders just isn't the best approach. And so this is where we come to your question. The NIH, or the National Institutes of Health, have launched a program called RDoC, or Research Domain Criteria. And the goal of RDoC is basically to help establish a biological basis for psychiatric diagnosis. And the way that it works is as follows. It breaks symptoms down not into psychiatric disorders, but into basic psychological traits. So let's take anxiety as an example. And it looks for the biology underlying anxiety at a number of different levels. So we study the biology underlying anxiety at the behavioral level, at the neurological level, at the level of circuits, down to the cell and the molecules they secrete, and even down to the genes. So by asking questions that probe the biology of different psychological traits and not disorders at each of these levels, the goal is that we may be able to gather a wide enough range of information that we can develop a biologically based diagnostic system. And so with that, I'll just summarize what we've talked about today. So we started by defining psychiatric disorders and seeing that they're largely diagnosed based on symptomatic presentation. We then mentioned the fact that much of what we currently understand about the biology of psychiatric disorders comes from our experience with the drugs that we use to treat them. And lastly, we touched on one project whose aim it is to help develop a biologically based system for diagnosing psychiatric disorders. So I'd like to thank everyone who was involved with the symposium today, and I'll take any questions. Yeah.
It sounds like some of the medications they use kind of just seem to treat symptoms based on kind of trial and error, and they don't really know what the medications are actually doing.
Okay, so So the question was, do we actually know what the medications are doing, or is it really just trial and error? And I certainly don't want to discredit the decades of research that have gone into understanding these mechanisms, but I think the fact is that our understanding is not yet complete. And so it's known, for example, that SSRIs target the serotonin system, and there seems to be this correlation between having increased serotonin and fewer symptoms in depression. But how that happens, exactly which serotonin neurons are involved in that and what are they doing and who are they talking to, that hasn't yet been completely sorted out. And there's been great progress made, but it's still very much a work in progress. Yes?
Just following that, you talked about the link between the different forms of the serotonin genes.
Yes.
But I mean, is anything known about the actual products of those genes?
Yes.
How they differ?
Yes.
Function or distribution or anything?
Yes. Yes. So there are the gene associations that link different forms of the serotonin transporter to different severities of symptoms. And then there is some biochemistry known about, does the shorter form take up more or less serotonin than the longer form? And I have to say, it doesn't totally make sense yet. So if I'm remembering correctly, I believe, so we said that the shorter form was associated with more severe depression, but I think it actually is less active than the longer form. So I think it would actually leave more serotonin in the synapse. But it's very nuanced and it's not the full picture. So yes, there is more known, but it hasn't totally clicked into place yet. Yes?
In the beginning, you showed that there were very large differences between quote, racial groups in the incidence of psychiatric disorders. Have we able to determine whether they were genetic or cultural?
Yeah.
Asian 2%, Hispanic 4.4. So
right.
Do we know what
That's a great question. So the question was, the gentleman noticed on one of the first slides I showed the graph of the prevalence of psychiatric disorders. There was quite a large difference if you broke it down by ethnic group. And is that difference due to experience, the environment, or to genes? And I think that's something that is being studied. I actually don't know too much about that area, but I know that it's something that people are working on both at the biological level and the psychological level. So I can look into it for you, but I don't happen to know offhand. Any other questions? Yeah.
You talked about drug therapy. There is still electroshock kinds of therapies used, and
yes.
I was just wondering what the latest is about that. I mean, they use it differently than they did in the old scary days. Right.
So I have to say we're getting to the outer limits of my area of expertise. But yeah, so ECT or electroconvulsive therapy is still used in cases of depression that are resistant to most pharmacotherapies or medications, and talk therapies. So I think it's very much a last resort, but it is still used. It's, of course, never forced on a patient, but it is still an option, yeah.
Overlap in research with Alzheimer's and other dementias?
I believe so, yes. Yes, so I know that, for example, depression is a very prominent feature of Parkinson's disease, and I think that's still a puzzle that's being teased apart. But yeah, there are symptomatic and I believe biological overlap with more neurologically based disorders. Yes?
What's the funding picture for this kind of research? I mean, it strikes me that anything that relies so much on self-reporting and sort of societal, there are issues societally, what does that do to your ability to get funding for this?
Yeah, so my understanding, and this is sort of through the grapevine, but my understanding is that the National Institute of Mental Health, so the NIMH, who actually is the subdivision of the NIH that is working on RDoC, that has put forward RDoC, will actually no longer accept grant proposals using the DSM-based classifications for disorders. And my understanding, again, through the grapevine, is that you have to have the RDoC-based diagnostic kind of code built into your grant proposal. So it is sort of being affected by this change in perspective. Yes?
If I wanted to learn more about kind of the current findings related to the kind of RDoC research, what would be good sources?
Yeah, so there's actually, so the question is where can you find more information on RDoC? And the NIMH has a great website. I believe there are videos and all sorts of things. So if you just Google RDoC NIMH, it should bring you right there. And in fact, I didn't show it here because it's kind of dry, but the way that they have RDoC set up is actually a matrix, so a table. They have one table for each sort of each sort of psychological construct, and then they have behavior, physiology, neurons, genes. You know, they have these different columns, and people are literally filling in the matrix, and it's pretty impressive. So I would definitely check it out.
So we're actually running a little bit late, so thank you. Surprise, surprise. But Teddy will be around and you can ask the questions later. Right now we have the panel discussions that are happening. So right over here, we're going to have the changing faces of science. And in the other room, we'll have the ask for evidence.